Hi everybody, welcome back to CMN 201, and this is for our class for Wednesday, December 2nd, and we're near towards the very ending of the semester. I wanted to talk about some due dates. Our last class is next week, believe it or not. That's Wednesday, the 9th of December, where we will be talking about the film that we are watching tonight, and that happens to be Get Out, our last film of the semester, and then just putting some closure onto the semester as a whole. In terms of your journals, I will accept them up until Wednesday, the 16th at 6 p.m. And that's the time and date for our final exam, if we were meeting in person. And what I will do is that I will post our final exam on the 16th at 6 p.m. And you've got 24 hours in which to return that examination. So you can hand it in on the 17th by 6 p.m. It's an essay exam that's open book, open notes. So you can use your journals and any of your resources. And I'll give you a series of essay questions and you can choose within them. And if we were taking this exam in person, you would have 3 hours to take the exam. So I would expect that you should spend 2 to 3 hours taking the exam. You're not expected to spend 24 hours certainly taking the exam. I just wanted to give some freedom and latitude to individuals who may not necessarily be able to take the exam at that particular point in time at the time that was scheduled for our final, which is this 16th at 6 p.m. And keep in mind as well that our final project will also be due on Wednesday, the 16th at 6 p.m. Certainly you can hand in your final project earlier. And if it turns out that you needed or wanted to do anything with your final project that would require some class time, just let me know. And I can perhaps squeeze you into part of my last class that I would be giving next week. But we would have to talk about that. Where we are is we finished up with the Blair Witch Project, and as many of you indicated, how quickly the group fell apart when they needed each other the most. And it's a theme that we've seen in other Gothic films, for instance, in George Romero's Night of the Living Dead, and that the monster is basically within rather than external. And we do get that sense as well in 28 Days Later, but one of the interesting things about 28 Days Later is that they're able to reformulate a kind of nuclear family. Even though they aren't blood related, the major characters do have a sense of concern and caring for one another, regardless of what their ethnicity or socioeconomic class or age or gender happens to be. And I suspect that this is very much indicative of one of the messages within the film. Or the idea of a rage virus is not very thinly veiled. The sense of hatred and violence and being universal and being contagious. And the opening, if you're familiar with some very famous other films such as Clockwork Orange, the opening might seem very familiar to you, as basically what we've got is this primate that's being force-fed the media and images of violence. And again, a commentary, and not too subtle, that we are the new primates that are being force-fed images of violence and that it is corrupting us. So we don't necessarily need to have the actual virus itself injected within us. But this updated zombie tale, even though George Romero maintains that it has nothing to do with his idea of zombie, because his zombies basically were reanimated corpses. These individuals are quite alive, but they are so overcome with the rage virus that ultimately, while they are alive, as part of the premises of the film, how long would it take for them to actually starve, is they act in increasingly violent ways. And perhaps one of the more interesting things about it is the speed at which these individuals can move. Again, George Romero took great exception to that. While his first zombie in Night of the Living Dead, the man who basically is chasing after Barbara in her car, might seem rather sprightly compared to what we've seen with other zombies. It's nothing like the fast zombie that we see in 28 Days Later. Many have argued that that's a perfect analogy for the new millennium of the 2000s, where things are going just so quickly that the zombies should go quickly as well. And think about how quickly technology has changed our society and continues to change our societies. As we talked about the importance of technology with the Blair Witch Project, in many ways it was able to have a good amount of foresight of where we could be with social media. This is a British film, and most of the films that we've seen thus far have been American, or of course our German expressionistic first film. So you get very much a sense of the British culture and the British cultural traditions. Britain is an island after all, and that's going to be an important piece here, is that they're able to quarantine. And that is one of the messages of the film, and I would suspect and suggest that it's perhaps one of the messages that we can take away at 2020, that quarantine does work if it is done effectively. Now, there is a sequel to this, 28 Weeks Later. I don't think it's anywhere nearly as good as 28 Days Later, but let's just say that let's just say that a quarantine sometimes are broken, and we'll leave it at that. If you ever wanted to see 28 Weeks Later. What we do see is the destruction of that current society, and the 2000s, as I had mentioned earlier, were a very interesting decade. The ending of the 1990s, where Blair Witch was occurring, and the beginning of the 2000s, where we get 28 Days Later. Lots of concerns about the apocalypse, which usually happens in each century. And there was particular concerns with Y2K, a computer virus that could lead to the freezing of all of our technology, which would probably be the destruction of modern society in the way that we think of it. Now, of course, this film was filmed before 9/11. However, it came out after 9/11, and it has eerie similarities to the idea of what could happen with the fall of society. And those were the questions that people were grappling with after 9/11. So in some ways, that's a very timely examination. The film critiques media. We see that at the very beginning when we see how these media images are basically inundating. And we learn from Selena about how ultimately the media was giving some somewhat questionable information and then stopped broadcasting altogether. It's a critique of government, and that's one of the major plots in this particular film, is that the savior, they think, which happens to be a military enclave that has projected itself as a place of salvation. Really what they want to do is to repopulate society by taking the women. And ultimately that means that Selena and Hannah are very in a very precarious situation, and we see how Jim ultimately is forced to defend them, which he does because this has become his new family in effect. Jim is quite capable of rage. Anyone is capable of rage. That's one of the major elements within the film itself, but there are perhaps justifications. And that said, certainly when Jim actually, in a very brutal scene at the end, he puts his thumbs in the eyeballs of one of the military oppressors. Many have said that it's a phallic symbol of penetration, since that's what the oppressors were trying to do to the females. We know that the government can't be trusted. At one point, Jim even asked, well, where's the government? And the response is, there is no government anymore. I can let you decide whether or not that could be said of our current times from a symbolic perspective, but it was quite literal in this particular film. And even critiques of consumerism. At the beginning, when Jim is wandering by himself and he's trying to figure out what's going on, we see lots of icons associated with London. Things like Big Ben, figurines that are just tossed on the ground. They're now meaningless. We see all of these billboards surrounding him that now are meaningless. We see him go after or encounter some money that now is meaningless, and even though he's stuffing it into his jacket. So what's meaningful is food and water and basically the necessities for survival, not paper, which is what basically money happens to be. It's an idea that Romero has oftentimes examined in his zombie films as well. But I think what's most important about this film is that we see the importance of community and others. The very first word we hear in the film is hello. And basically, Jim is looking for community. And then at the very ending, you could see that the word is hello as Jim and Hannah and Selena are trying to get the attention of a plane that's flying overhead, which means that civilization is continuing, that this outbreak has been reserved to this particular island, Britain, and hasn't necessarily spread across the globe. As they use sheets and other fabric to try to spell out the word hello. But as they're spelling it out, the focus is on the word hell. And I think that's the contrast that we see in this film. When you're alone, this is hell. And when you are with other individuals, hello. And that's where you can have the possibility of salvation. And you don't see the destruction of society. That said, humans tend to be very human-centric. The sense that this is the ending of the world. No, it's not the ending of the world. It's the ending of humanity, perhaps, but it's hardly the ending of the world. We see the continuation of society in a really beautiful shot with some wild horses that are running, and they're taken aback by the beauty of it all as they're in the countryside. And I think it's quite telling that the horses are both black and white. And again, that's a commentary, I believe, in the sense that we shouldn't be looking at color when we're thinking about forming community. With this creation of a new family unit and society that's going to be necessary for survival. And Selena ultimately learns that love is indeed important. And that's something that we see through the father-daughter relationship as well. In terms of thinking about the last film for the semester, that happens to be Get Out. And that film is supposed to be representative of the 2010s. So this would be a decade where, and if you think about 2008, Barack Obama became the first president of the United States. And there were questions about whether or not this meant that the United States had moved beyond its history of racism. Sadly, we found out that was not the case. And whether or not this was going to be a sign of our ability to be able to unite as a peoples. And again, sadly, as we know, with current times, that's hardly been the case. But I think that the film Get Out examines that and shows very nicely that underneath the polite veneer of acceptance and inclusion, there's a very ugly underbelly. It's done by Jordan Peele, who is known for his comedy. He had a comedy sketch show called Key and Peele on Comedy Central. And he also is a huge horror buff. And up-and-coming filmmaker. I expect great things of him. If you've seen his film Us, it was absolutely fantastic. I cannot recommend it enough to you if you need to see a film, though right now what you need to see is Get Out. And as some of you have already indicated when you were talking about Dawn of the Dead and George Romero's decision to cast an African-American actor in the lead role of Ben, we've got very little African-American representation in horror films. And if there is African-American representation, they're usually viewed as minor characters in subservient roles. And Ben is obviously a strong major character, but he's killed at the end. And here in Get Out, not only do we have a strong male character who's African-American, we have other African-American characters as well. So initially, while this film was basically viewed as a commentary on the true monstrosity in America, racism, there are other ways that you can view this film as well. So I ask you to consider things like class and socioeconomic class, as well as think about race when you are watching this particular film, which originally had an alternative ending. And what I thought would be interesting to do would be for you to watch the film first, and you can see that I was able to find a link online for that particular film. And then to watch the alternate ending, which is about 4 or 5 minutes long or so. That would be your attendance question today, is do you prefer the original ending or do you prefer the film ending or the alternate ending of the film, and some of the reasons why. So I'm not necessarily done talking about 28 days later, but I thought that we could do that for next class because I wanted to save a little bit of time to again have you think about your course project. And if you haven't already contacted me about what you're thinking about doing, please do so, because as you can see, we're at the tail end of the semester. And if you've got any questions or concerns at all about the course project or anything else in the class, please let me know, because next class will be our last class of the semester. But as many of you indicated, with 28 days later, it seems to be eerily prophetic in some respects, and perhaps quite useful in terms of our contemporary society and some of the challenges that we are now facing. Almost universally, the answer to the question of what we were supposed to learn for 28 days later was to listen to the scientists. And I can't emphasize that enough, that I too, being an academic, would say that we should listen to the scientists. That said, there's a bit of tension in the film because the scientists are responsible, at least in 28 days later, because they've created the rage virus. As they said, in order to cure, you need to be able to understand. That said, they were very clear to the activists, don't do this, and the activists did it anyway, thinking what they were doing was in their best interest and in the best interest of the lab animals, and that was exactly not the case. And again, I think it goes to show the various levels of gray, how many sides in our society can be both right and wrong at the same time. So definitely, I think we see a critique of science and the scientific establishment in this film, as well as a acknowledgement that we do need to listen to scientists, as many of you put it. We also see a critique of animal activism, and although the motivation might be a good one, extremism can result in some very unintended consequences. So again, I'll finish up with 28 days later next class, and we'll talk about Get Out and put some closure onto everything. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and enjoy Get Out. Bye-bye.